My name is John Kenyon. I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature organization, and I'd like to welcome you to our 11th award ceremony for the Paul Engle Prize. So thank you for joining us. So tonight's event is part of our Iowa City Book Festival, which started last night. How many folks were at the Anthony Doerr event last night? Oh great, quite a few of you. It was a wonderful way to kick off the festival. I'm glad you could join us. And now we have night 2 of 2 weeks worth of programming. We went a little crazy this year with a lot of partner organizations wanted to do programming with us, and so our schedule continued to expand, and here we are with a 2-week-long slate of programs. So thanks for joining us, and I hope we'll see you again over the course of those 2 weeks. So the festival is designed to celebrate the newest work from authors from all around the country and occasionally from around the world. But this event and this prize are designed to do much more. Iowa City earned the designation as the 3rd UNESCO City of Literature in the world back in 2008. And our organization was formed to manage that designation with the goal to promote, enhance, and add to the community's literary assets. But we also wanted to leverage our designation and the attention that comes with it to recognize writers who were doing exemplary things on and off the page. So in 2011, we founded the Paul Engle Prize. So Paul, as anyone who has been to this event before surely knows, was the longtime director of the Iowa Writers Workshop and co-founded with his wife Hua Ling the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. And we do have some folks from the International Writing Program here with us this evening, so thank you very much for joining us and welcome. Paul was also a well-regarded poet, a playwright, an essayist, an editor, a critic, the list goes on. Paul went above and beyond in his efforts to help writers, to promote our community, and to build empathy by connecting the far corners of the world through the written word. So in creating this prize, we wanted to recognize writers not just for their books, but for the way they affect their communities and the world at large through their efforts beyond the page. As stated in the call for nominations that we issue each year, we seek to honor an individual who, like Paul Engle, represents a pioneering spirit in the world of literature through writing, editing, publishing, or teaching, and whose active participation in the larger issues of the day has contributed to the betterment of the world through the literary arts. The prize includes a $20,000 award, a one-of-a-kind work of art made by our friends at MC Ginsberg, and a trip to the Iowa City Book Festival. Not necessarily in that order of importance. The Paul Engle Prize is made possible through the generous support of the city of Coralville. This has been a wonderful partnership for us, and this beautiful space at the Coralville Public Library has become synonymous with the prize. So our thanks to the city of Coralville for the support and to the staff of the library for welcoming us each year, and for setting up some extra chairs tonight as well. So thank you for that. Now we will be joined by Library Director Allison Ames-Galstead in a moment, but first I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator. Liz Lenz is a prolific writer who seems to be there with wise analysis of every issue of importance in our culture, with pieces in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Columbia Journalism Review, and the list goes on. She has 2 books on the shelves thus far, Godland from 2019 and Belabored from 2020. And her 3rd book, This American Ex-Wife, is forthcoming. Liz also publishes a regular newsletter, Men Yell at Me, that has become a must-read for those wanting smart takes from Red State America. Liz will introduce this year's winner, and then we'll conduct a Q&A with her later in the program. So please help me welcome Liz Lenz.
Hello, Eastern Iowa, because I assume there's some people from Cedar Rapids here too. Just one. All right, that's fine. In 2004, Rebecca Solnit wrote this about hope. Hope is an embrace of the unknown and knowable, the alternative to the certainty of both optimists and pessimists. Optimists think it will be fine without our involvement. Pessimists take the opposite position. Both excuse themselves from acting. It's the belief that what we do matters, even though how and why and when it may matter, who and what it may impact are not things we can know beforehand. We may not, in fact, know them afterward either, but they matter all the same. And history is full of people whose influence was most powerful after they were gone. Solnit's words, written for a post-9/11 world, are still prescient and powerful in our world that is now post-Roe. For years, Rebecca Solnit has been our voice crying out in the wilderness, our John the Baptist, preparing the way for the weird, the wild, the women, and the wanderers, and is now working to protect the wilderness. She's written over 24 books, which include Orwell's Roses, my new favorite, Recollections of My Nonexistence, Hope in the Dark, Men Explain Things to Me, A Paradise Built in Hell, The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster, and A Field Guide to Getting Lost. A product of the California public education system from kindergarten to graduate school. She writes regularly for The Guardian, serves on the board of the climate change group Oil Change International, and recently launched the climate project Not Too Late. In Recollections of My Nonexistence, she writes, nonfiction is at its best an act of putting the world back together or tearing some piece of it apart to find what's hidden beneath the assumptions or conventions. And in this sense, creation and destruction can be akin. The process can be incandescent, with excitement, whether from finding some unexpected scrap of information or from recognizing the patterns that begin to arise as the fragments begin to assemble. Something you didn't know well comes into focus, and the world makes sense in a new way, or an old assumption is guttered, and then you try to write it down. Rebecca has given her readers so much from her writing, a roadmap for getting lost, hope, perspective, and a voice. Her voice, through which she stitches together the broken pieces of this world to create something beautiful and wonderful, and in doing so has shown others the way to finding their own voices, their own power, their own patchwork of worlds and beauty. So thank you so much for that. And because of all of that work, tonight Rebecca is receiving the Paul Engle Award, my word, which will be presented by Coralville Public Library Director Allison Ames Galstead, who's coming up right now to do that. So thank you so much.
The city of Coralville is an enthusiastic supporter of the UNESCO City of Literature, and we are particularly proud to sponsor the Paul Engle Prize, which includes a $20,000 check and one-of-a-kind work of art. This year's work of art was inspired by the atlases, and it's very delicate, so I'm a little nervous. So there's 3 maps, New Orleans and New York and San Francisco, engraved or etched in this piece of wood, which is an old piece of wood from the original roof beams of M.C. Ginsburg. And then that's crowned by this beautiful handcrafted California poppy in honor of your home state, made out of silver and brass. And then the base of it is sort of the hallmark of, and all of the Engle Prizes, they all have the state of Iowa with Iowa City marked with a gem. So on behalf of the Iowa City of Literature, and with the support of the city of Coralville, it is my privilege to present Rebecca Solnit with the Paul Engle Prize.
oh my God, I came in and thinking like, you're not supposed to put that many chairs out because most of them are going to be empty. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your masks. I'm going to go see somebody who just had open heart surgery after this trip, and I'm trying very hard to not become a vector. Thank you, library. This looks a lot like the hometown library I grew up with. That was my refuge and sanctuary, and kind of where so many of the books that kind of woke up my imagination and my desire to be a writer were. So it's thank you, libraries and librarians who I know have been fighting some of the tough battles for the last 20-something years. Thank you, Paul, at Paul Engle Award. Thank you, John Kenyon. And thank you, Iowa. I'm kind of having a good time here and wondering if I'm secretly an undergraduate, because I've been really enjoying the bobo tea around the corner from the hotel and sort of wandering, through some of the beautiful spaces here. So I wrote a talk. And thank you, Liz, who I had to tear myself away from continuing to talk to so that we could do all this, but is clearly the most fun person I've met in a while. So you just wait till she comes up here and fireworks happen. So when I was told I won this award, I went and looked up Paul Engle, about whom I then knew very little. Much of what I read was recent scholarship on his work in founding the Iowa Writing Program and its connection to Cold War-era goals of combating communism. Iowa Writing Program graduate Eric Bennett did extensive research and concluded of the program Engle led. Their promotion of American values fostered a literature of individualism and domesticity and suppressed a literature of solidarity and big ideas. Corollaries to this theory of what writing should be might be the axiom, show, don't tell, and William Carlos Williams' famous, no ideas but in things. It was all kind of striking to me because probably what I do could reasonably be described as a literature of solidarity and big ideas about big nebulous things like democracy and feminism and climate, whether or not I do it well. Also, I do a hell of a lot of tell, don't show, AKA at writing editorials and opinion pieces. That, of course, brings me to another point, that I could be described as trouble. But I'm sure the judges for this prize knew that when they invited me, and I respect them all the more for it. I might note that nonfiction can be about the extremely personal. I give you memoir, but it can also be a biography of an idea or a movement or a place, and many other things besides. And in a lot of recent writing, the two intertwine. The idea that the alternative to communism was the apotheosized individual accords well with social Darwinism and capitalism and a Hobbesian vision of nature as a war of each against each. But the opposite of thing is not always its antidote. The solution to unbearable heat is not unbearable cold, of starvation is not being force-fed. But what struck me when I read about Engle and the post-war era was how much our ideas have changed, both socially and scientifically. And if he was of his time, I think in what I'm about to say now, I'm of my time, and perhaps somebody in 40 or 50 years will be talking about how dated Solnit's ideas seemed, but that person is either not yet born or a very small child, so I'm safe for now. But there is this often this belief that we've arrived at the final end of all truth and knowledge and insight, and we can proceed with confidence. But if history has taught me anything, is that we haven't gotten it perfectly right yet, and there will be new kinds of awareness, new ethical standards that we will not perfectly live up to, as those of you who are more than 12 know, because the 70s and 80s no longer pass muster, let alone anything before that. So, just as we now recognize that a forest is a collaborative and collective organism rather than a crowd of autonomous and independent or even competitive trees, thanks particularly to forest ecology professor Suzanne Simard's research gathered up in Finding the Mother Tree, which I'm sure this library has. So we have different ideas about human nature and how we thrive than, say, Margaret Thatcher did when in the late 1970s she famously said, "There's no such thing as society." Now we know that even babies are social beings, and even trees can and do form societies of mutual aid. Mostly I want to talk about and against the idea of the individual and how that shaped how I write and what I write. By individual, I mean a freestanding, autonomous person, unconnected and unbeholden to others, which sounds like a dude already. My audience, mostly of women, how this must resonate for you, as I know it does for Liz. We were just talking about very relevant things behind it. So, unconnected and unbeholden to others, not part of any larger whole. Individualism is in some ways an ideology, but it's also a statement about the nature of reality, a reality very useful for free market capitalism and the exploitation of nature, and for machismo, and is the driving idea behind the classic cowboy movies that were really about Cold War individualism and masculinity, not very much about what the West was like in the 19th century. It's your misfortune and none of my own, sings the cowboy, herding the calves to their slaughter in the old song. And you could call it also a not my brother's keeper ideology. And what I once wrote about as the ideology of isolation. In the Harper's essay of that title, I wrote, if you boil the strange soup of contemporary right-wing ideology down to a sort of bouillon cube, if you carve away to the very core of far-right utterances, you find this concept. Things are not connected to other things. People are not connected to other people. And they are better off unconnected. Out of this great disconnect comes all sorts of anti-systematic thinking. If you take it all the way to its illogical conclusion, facts themselves are freestanding items the self-made man can manufacture for use as he sees fit. And I have to boast that I wrote this before the election of Donald Trump. Facts got so freestanding and free-floating that they, never mind. They may wish that every man was an island, entire unto himself, but no one is wholly independent. And it was kind of lovely that Anthony Doerr apparently projected this next paragraph last night, but I get to repeat it out loud. Nothing is entirely separate from anything else. You can't survive without taking the world in as air for your lungs for more than a moment. You didn't give birth to or raise yourself. You won't bury yourself. And in between, you won't produce most of the goods and services you depend upon to live. Your very guts are so full of microorganisms you rely upon to digest your food that the majority of cells in your body do not have human DNA. And every day you eat other entities, plant and animal, that other people grew. We are nodes on intimate. The word is actually intricate. Third time's the lucky one. We are nodes on intricate systems, synapses snapping on a great collective brain. We are in it together, for better or worse. If you can't pick off a few beavers without changing the hydrology of a watershed, then you have to think about the other people and animals and fish and wetlands and plants in the watershed, or the overall value of the watershed as it is with the beaver dams. Unless you deny the realities of ecological interconnectedness because they interfere with your right to maximum individual freedom, a freedom to not be bothered by others' needs and the good of the whole, which conservatives routinely do. I did mention that I was trouble. And from California, and not just that, San Francisco. So, the ideologues of isolation are upset by the solutions to climate change, by the need for regulation, cooperation between industry and government, and between nations. More than that, the very idea of climate change is offensive to isolationists because it tells us more powerfully and urgently than anything else ever has that everything is connected, nothing exists in isolation. I'm really focused on climate right now, so that's the end of that bit of Harper's. And I will just mention something I was going to in my thank you, which is that the $20,000 will all go to climate organizations I support, which will be really lovely. I often usually anything that comes in gets dumped into the bank account and what goes out isn't a specific source. But when I heard about the award, I'm like, it's all going to climate. So thank you for that. I'm kind of trying to walk my talk, but there's more talking, I'm afraid. I would argue that the notions packed into individualism and isolationism draw on outdated or inaccurate descriptions of the world. We could discuss this as a matter of social dynamics or consciousness or ethics, but I want to start with science. In one of the most wonderful essays I've read in a very long time, 3 biologists declared in their very title, a symbiotic view of life. We have never been individuals, the exact opposite of Thatcher's there is no such thing as society. The trio write in this beautiful 2012 essay, symbiosis is becoming a core principle of contemporary biology. The discovery of symbiosis throughout the animal kingdom is fundamentally transforming the classical conception of an insular individuality into one in which interactive relationships among species blur the boundaries of the organism and obscures the notion of essential identity. The basic unit, in a sense, is the relationship between, not the individual alone, and relationships inflect each other, and what we call an individual is a collection of relationships within and beyond the physical boundaries of self. Their concluding sentence is, we are all lichens, meaning that like lichens, we are teams, societies, collaborations, lichens being a collaboration between fungi and cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. This 2012 essay prompted another wonderful essay in 2015 called Queer Theory for Lichens by David Griffith. That's sort of my favorite thing anybody's written recently. And here I might interject that I once did not love the term nonfiction, just since it defined what the rest of us do by fiction. Then I realized that just as non-white means pretty much everybody else, so nonfiction puts, and there I think it's kind of a weird term because I don't think whiteness should define everybody else. But I love that nonfiction puts essay writing in company with encyclopedias, manifestos, letters, philosophical dialogue, scientific papers, laundry lists, and all sorts of wonderful forms of literary expression, including quite often poetry. When I was young, most writing programs did not recognize what's now called creative nonfiction, which is part of why I have a journalism degree from the Graduate School of Journalism at Berkeley. Also, I needed to figure out how to make a living, and it was more helpful for that. So writing programs did not recognize what's now called creative nonfiction. So fiction and poetry seemed like they sat upon twin thrones together. This might be why it took me a long time to recognize, even while being a lover and avid reader of poetry, that most modern poetry has a strong family resemblance to the essay. It's with us. We get poetry. Poetry's over here. While we might note that right-wingers are now very prone to fiction in the most Orwellian sense of lies and deceit, no one writes a novel much outside the realms of people trying to write a novel. But people giving a speech or writing a science paper or a love letter often compose quite stellar essays, as is the case with the scientists in these 2 papers I would call essays. Queer Theory for Lichens broadens the notion of generation, which we could call creativity, from heterosexual reproduction to the many ways, where's 5? To the many ways, this page turning thing, very tricky. To the many ways in which plants, animals, fungi, and combinations thereof can be generative. Lichens, Griffiths writes, are not anomalies, but are rather illustrative of the fact that life and nature are found, if anywhere, in the complex and queer cobbling together of multi-species relationships. Crucially for my argument, he continues, this decenters heterosexual biological reproduction and vertical inheritance as the only way that life produces and reproduces. By which he means that there are many forms of creativity, and perhaps queering nature is like opening up the literary canon. Amitav Ghosh, best known as a novelist, has published 2 essayistic books about climate change recently. This year's Amazing, The Nutmeg's Curse, about climate colonialism, and 2016's The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unimaginable. In the latter book, which actually began as a series of talks, he writes that climate change casts a much smaller shadow within the landscape of literary fiction than it does even in the public arena is not hard to establish, and he sees this as the larger problem of lack of engagement with the crisis. 6 years since his book came out, I'm happy to say that public and even literary engagement are way up. But his argument is interesting. He says that the novel's terrain is the probable and the everyday, and emerged as a genre, in his words, compatible with the new regularity of bourgeois life, which might not feel so regular in Florida now, let alone Bangladesh, Puerto Rico, and other places experiencing climate destruction. Gosh also argues that literature can also induce us to not imagine things, and he talks about the harsh reception by John Updike of a Middle Eastern novel that tried to describe collective rather than individual experience impacted by the fossil fuel industry, and concluding of Updike's response. This, then, is the paradox and the price of conceiving of fiction and politics in terms of individual moral adventure. It negates possibility itself. I wonder if an answer Gosh didn't seem to consider is that the novel will not, or at least need not, be the dominant literary form of our time. And perhaps nonfiction's time has come because it can and does do all these things he complains that novels have not. And did I mention poetry's over here? Poetry's good at this too. Do we have poets in the house? Hello, poetry. So, it delivers on the possibilities which might be proven on the fact that he had to shift to nonfiction to demand them. He says a bit later in a certain kind of tale, apparently inanimate things suddenly come alive. This, as I said earlier, he continues, is one of the uncanniest effects of the Anthropocene, this renewed awareness of the elements of agency and consciousness that humans share with many other beings, and perhaps the climate itself. Renewed, I think, for those of us who are non-Indigenous, not so close to the land and other life forms. He reminds me that while a lot of Indigenous cultures invested what we think of as inanimate objects, stones, mountains, springs, streams, with agency and sometimes consciousness and rights, capitalism was predicated on the deadness of the world, and an unlimited right to commodify and exploit nature, and ultimately other beings, including other human beings. All this is changing. Scientific American recently reported, in the early 2000s, the idea of giving legal rights to nature was on the fringe of environmental legal theory and public consciousness. Today, New Zealand's, oh my God, I have to pronounce this word, New Zealand's Wanganui River is a person under domestic law, and India's Ganges River was recently granted human rights. In Ecuador, the Constitution enshrines nature's right to integral respect, and I might add that Chile's new Constitution, which didn't pass, did also enshrine the rights of nature. My friend Robert McFarlane is writing a book about that, and it's expanding. This is about Indigenous ideas influencing the mainstream of subtler imagination, and the very word influence has to do with fluids, as mainstream means rivers. So the confluences are coming. To recognize that everything is connected is to lose some of the loneliness of modern life, but also to recognize some of the responsibility that comes with interconnectedness, a world of living systems, especially as human beings have become so powerful that we have unintentionally changed the natural world we depend upon. We now need to step back and do it intentionally to reverse that damage. Should also say that I decided a couple years ago every talk I gave would be partly about climate change, and it's actually completely natural at this point to talk about literature and climate change. And because it is the crisis of our time, the central issue of our time in this decisive decade for what kind of a future the world will have. And I'm doing my best and invite you all to, I'm sure some of you are doing a lot. There's so much we can do, so much we need to do. And so much of it is actually kind of an exciting adventure. Some of the possibilities coming forward are really about abundance and building a better, more beautiful, more equitable, and more hopeful world, not just staving off the worst. Maybe a more inviting word than responsibility would be reciprocity, because the responsibility goes both ways and could also be called, perhaps, love. As part of that, we need better stories, Or maybe we've always had better stories, from natural history to indigenous legends to poetry to mysticism, and they just need to have more prominence. This is something I took on a few years ago in an essay called When the Hero is the Problem. The versions of heroism, as in defending the good and the vulnerable we are given, are mostly about exceptional individuals whose talents are for inflicting and enduring dramatic violence, mostly in one-on-one combat. I give you the Marvel universe. The versions of history we are given also tend to zoom in on individuals who are shown as exceptional and superior to ordinary people. There was actually one terrible movie out of Iceland called Women at War that prompted this essay, which was a lot of fun to write. It was in LitHub a few years ago, When the Hero is the Problem. There was this woman engaging in eco-sabotage that didn't really make sense because it wasn't actually addressing the problems it was supposed to address. But she was a choir director, and the people who made the movie didn't seem to get her ability to like scurry through the landscape hunted by helicopters and use a crossbow to take out electrical things. Had nothing to do with how to save the environment. A choir director was the perfect metaphor. If you can get a group to act together, you can build a movement. If you can build a movement, you can change the world. She had pictures of Nelson Mandela and Gandhi in her house. And it was such a joke on the movie. Gandhi and Mandela are not notable for their martial arts skills or their, they're notable for motivating huge groups of people to change the world extremely successfully. The talent of those who change the world is almost the opposite of violence. It's the capacity to organize and inspire people, to contribute to a shared vision and sense of possibility and collective action. And that's what actually changes things when it comes to human rights and the environment and so much more. They are catalysts more than leaders, figureheads who are not the whole ship, let alone the wind in the sails. We need stories that make us fall in love with collectives, that help us dream that change is possible through cooperation and solidarity, that tell us the real history of how change happens. So I'm not even opposed to individualism on an ethical or aesthetic basis, but because it's not a very accurate description of who we are or of how to change the world. Here I might add that this award is named after Paul Engle, but administered by the UNESCO City of Literature. UNESCO is part of the United Nations, the organization born in response to the horror of the Second World War as an attempt to inculcate global cooperation and peace, to put individual nations into a cooperative whole, to make societies function the way that trees in a healthy forest do, as a community. I took up this question of the boundaries of the self in another way in my anti-memoir, The Faraway Nearby. Anti-memoir because the narrative was not the linear thread that was my own story. The book is a braiding of the many strands of stories that helped me through a difficult time and a reflection on the stories that liberate or imprison us. Because we so often celebrate stories like, oh, stories are good, stories are wonderful, but there's stories about how white people are better or men are better than women, or it's natural to be straight and unnatural to be anything else, or women shouldn't have jurisdiction over their own bodies, or those immigrants are, should, well, you catch my gist, and that I'm from San Francisco. So the book is a braiding of the many threads of stories that helped me through a difficult time, and a reflection on the stories that liberate or imprison us, and on the way that empathy is both a storytelling art and the way we enlarge our boundaries beyond the self. I wrote in the opening passages, what's your story? It's all in the telling. Stories are compasses in architecture. We navigate by them. We build our sanctuaries and our prisons out of them, and to be without a story is to be lost in the vastness of a world that spreads in all directions like Arctic tundra or sea ice. To love someone is to put yourself in their place, we say, which is to put yourself in their story or figure out how to tell yourself their story, which means that a place is a story and stories are geography, and empathy is first of all an act of imagination, a storyteller's art, and then a way of traveling from here to there. What is it like to be the old man silenced by a stroke, the young man facing the executioner, the woman walking across the border, the child on the roller coaster, the person you've only read about, or the one next to you in bed? We tell ourselves stories in order to live or to justify taking lives, even our own, by violence or by numbness, and the failure to live. Tell ourselves stories that save us and stories that are the quicksand in which we thrash and the well in which we drown. Stories of justification, of accursedness, of luck and star-crossed love, or versions clad in the cynicism that is at times a very elegant garment. Sometimes the story collapses and it demands that we recognize we've been lost or terrible or ridiculous or just stuck. Sometimes change arrives like an ambulance or a supply drop. Not a few stories are sinking ships, and many of us go down with these ships, even when the lifeboats are bobbing all around us. The crises of our time are in no small part storytelling crises, not because we don't have better stories, but because the better stories have been pushed to the margins. The destructive stories have fed upon us, fed upon our vulnerabilities, our fears, have been fed with money, with oil, with hate, with weapons. In the faraway nearby, I wanted to describe love and empathy as creative acts of listening and imagining what others are feeling, since we cannot literally feel the pain of others the way we feel pain in our own bodies. To recognize that we expand or transcend our own boundaries when we do so, or we are locked into the small confines of the self when we are selfish, indifferent, oblivious, hostile. To understand, just as the Queer Lichens essay recognizes other forms of generation, these other forms of creativity, and embrace them in writing and stories in our lives, perhaps to describe forms of love that are of necessity imaginative and creative, and of creative work as a kind of love, and all of it as border crossing, weaving us together. Thank you.
Rebecca, hello. Thank you for coming to Iowa.
My pleasure.
Oh my gosh, we're so happy that you're here. I'm happy. You guys are happy too, right? Okay, there we go, there we go. I need the crowd to be a little less Iowa, a little bit more Baptist. Amen. All right, thank you.
Lead your revival meeting. This is great.
I just like to whip Iowans up into a frenzy. That's my spiritual gift.
Not a small one.
No, they're kind of tough, a little stoic, but I got it. But nobody wants to hear about me. We want to hear about you. So you have written that you've always loved books and writing, and that was one of my favorite parts of Recollections of My Nonexistence. But you didn't name drop any of those books that were so formative for you. Could you name drop a few now?
There's so many layers. There's a funny thing where people pretend their influences are the things they read as an adult, but kids' books, happened to before adult books. So there's lots of kind of chronicles of Narnia things, and but the things that actually made me understand, because as a kid, I just actually, I didn't really understand books till I learned how to read, which apparently, according to my mother, happened very fast in first grade. Then I briefly wanted to be a librarian because I got to spend a whole day in the best place on earth. Then I realized somebody actually wrote the books. And then I was made my third and final career choice, and at 6, and then I just books were stories because that's what they were as a kid. So it was really as a teenager I started slowly realizing it wasn't going to be fiction. And one of the big things for me was Jorge Luis Borges' Labyrinths. I bought a cheap Penguin paperback. I still have it. The spine is broken and the pages are loose, but I will keep it forever. And it just showed me how creative, and it's arguable if Borges is nonfiction, but he's not interested in what conventional fiction does, which is explore a character and kind of the drama of a plot, even the things that might have made up characters, or about the nature of Zohars and Alephs and time and memory and things like that. And this kind of, and of course the Library of Babel, one of the great images of the infiniteness of information. And, and then Orwell, Virginia Woolf, James Baldwin, and, a number of people who kind of opened up what nonfiction could be were really important to me. And Pauline Kael, who comes from the town next to me. I don't know. Some of you are older and remember Pauline Kael, the New Yorker film reviewer, who was cut quite a swath. And, and then later other people, a lot of Latin Americans like Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatistas, who made, because political writing can be so dead and stale, and Marxist language can fossilize anything it touches. And Marcos created this kind of lyrical, poetic, evocative, image-rich kind of poetry manifesto form, with the rest of the Zapatistas that felt like it was political language reborn. It was a huge influence on me. I'm now trying to picture this sort of like influence shelf at home, but a lot of other Latin American writers, Eduardo Galeano and things like, so that was some of it. And like they continue, I still look at things and it's like, oh yeah, you could do that. Oh yeah, and so.
Yeah, I'm sure that's how a lot of people feel when they read your writing. Like, oh, I can put all this together in this way. Well, not as well as you. We're all poor imitators.
But I think that's one of the things that books can give you is permission to imagine, feel, be in some way that might not have been so available. And I always love those stories of people's lives being changed by books. My friend Cleve Jones, who is Harvey Milk, the first sort of elected gay official in the U.S. So Cleve felt like he was the only gay person in the world growing up in Arizona and thought he would just have to commit suicide or something. And then there was actually an issue of Life magazine about gay life that came out, I think, in the late 60s. And Cleve was like, oh, I'm not alone. And, so like these things can, it's not always that direct.
Yeah.
And I left out all the horse books I loved as a kid.
Misty of Chincoteague.
Actually my favorite was, God, what is it? The one about the Gondolin Arabian, King of the Wind.
Oh, yes.
Oh, I love those.
Yeah.
Hello, my people.
A lot of horse girls in the room. I can feel the horse girl energy.
But what's actually amazing about that is like this nice lady in the mid-50s wrote a book for kids about that begins with celebrating Ramadan in Morocco, and its protagonist is a mute Muslim boy and a horse. And it was kind of, it was really interesting that speaking of empathy, I think it was probably the first Muslim I encountered was the horse boy who takes care of the stallion who was one of the 3 stallions from the Middle East that founded thoroughbreds upon the sort of sturdier English horses. I visited his grave with Robert McFarland.
Oh my gosh.
But I digress. That's all I have ever done. Everything I've ever written is a digression. Because the shortest distance between 2 points is not really where it gets interesting.
Nope. That was in the book on walking. Yes, you talk about that.
Probably.
There's so many of them.
You've read them more recently than I have, probably.
I reread and powered through. I am so ready for this night.
Quiz on Tuesday.
Quiz on Tuesday. Oh my God. All right, so this next question we were discussing behind the fireplace, because I had said, feel free to nix this question, because it's something that I think about a lot when I read other women who are writers who write in ways that I find powerful, and I just wonder how that identity between artist and the life as a woman is negotiated. So we were talking about it. I was telling you, please feel free to nix it. And you said something very interesting to me that made me rewrite the question, because I'd heard you tell Emma Watson, of all people, that you've been able to be prolific because you've avoided children and marriage. And and I gotta say, getting rid of marriage really frees up your free time. So if anybody's looking to dump something off their to-do list. But you said something so powerful. We're just gonna move on, guys.
But I want...
Amen, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, sure. Applause for divorce here.
I want to
to throw in a joke from a breakup many years ago. Where I was
it.
like, of course I look great. I've just lost 180 pounds.
Yes. Yeah, when my very best friend of 20 years got divorced, we did a congratulations on, losing, I think it was about 185 pounds, cake, for her. And then ate pizza and cake and drank champagne all night. It was more fun than the wedding. But you said that we're telling the story incorrectly, and I want you to tell the people kind of what you were telling me about, because I think it also fits with what you were saying in your talk about we're telling the wrong stories. We're telling the wrong stories about women and art. We're telling the wrong stories about labor. So that's not really a question. Go.
Starting pistol and all, speaking of horse races. And someday I just wish a man interviewing another man was like, but you're so prolific, how can you be a good father? Are you just dumping the work on somebody else? Because what I was saying to Liz is what drove me nuts during the pandemic, there were so many stories about women's working lives, careers being ruined because they were doing all the work at home. And I just wanted to see some story about, like, here's Greg. His career is fucking awesome right now because he dumps all the work on his wife. And he had kids, but he doesn't do a damn thing for them, doesn't know the name of their teachers or when their dental appointments are.
Yeah.
Greg?
Yeah, you said that was
I
his
did say
name.
Greg. Nothing against Gregs in general. Some of my best friends. But we constantly tell stories about things that happen to women without telling who's doing them. I actually wrote an essay years ago called The Case of the Missing Perpetrator because the Center for Disease Control put out a little guideline for women about how, like, you shouldn't abuse alcohol because if you drink too much, you could get battered, an STD, or pregnant. And, like, show me the vodka that gets you pregnant. Show me the whiskey that is an STD. And what they really meant is that men are very dangerous and you have to have your wits around you, but we don't want to identify that men are a public health danger to women. So we're not going to tell men to be responsible. We're just going to tell women that you have to always be alert and on your guard. And we need to protect men so much, not only will we tell them it's not their responsibility, but we won't even mention them because it might make them uncomfortable. And this is something that's been happening with abortion forever. Wanted pregnancies usually involve a lot of strutting around by impregnators with cigars and stuff. And unwanted pregnancies, are usually women going to the abortion clinic or the doctor or whatever so often on their own. And I know a lot of men are good and stand up for what's right, but the demonization of women for pregnancy, and I joke that women are the whore of Babylon for getting pregnant, but it was apparently an immaculate conception because nobody else was involved. And, there has been nothing in the anti-abortion movement saying men need to stop creating unwanted pregnancies. You can actually achieve a wanted pregnancy without the direct participation of a man, but it is very hard to achieve an unwanted pregnancy that way. And yet we don't talk about the role of men in unwanted pregnancies. We have all this stuff where we write men out of the story. Literally, there was a pandemic story about how the burden has fallen on women's shoulders. And it's like, who the fuck dropped it? Yeah. Somebody unmentionable. So I feel like we tell these stories constantly about women's lot in a way that just makes the story sort of mysterious and like something women just need to fix by themselves. And one of the big breakthroughs for me as a feminist, which some of the stuff up there, you might know that is something I do, was realizing that nobody ever thought that people of color should solve racism without white people's participation, because racism was largely a thing white people do. But feminism was supposed to be yet another form of house cleaning women were supposed to do without men's participation. And that's not really, how it works. And so writing, so we kind of need to change the story around all those things. And it's something I've actually talked and written about, and I wanted to bring that up too. And I do think that I might have made different choices about things like children if it was just like I was going to go have my big life and somebody else was going to bottom line it all.
And actually, I would like to think that I would have been very egalitarian, but I thought it extremely likely I'd end up with the lioness's share, should we call it?
Yes.
Because I saw that happen over and over and over and over and over again.
Yeah. And justice for whiskey and vodka. They don't deserve that.
Yeah.
They don't deserve that kind of, those lies. Yeah, they don't.
Nobody has ever been beaten up by a martini. You might feel that way, but it will not.
I was going to say, well.
It will not actually assault you.
I'm gonna do one more question and then maybe open it up to the audience if you all have questions. So start thinking of what you want to ask, because I have a million more questions, but again.
But she is so delightful. Do you want us to go?
We're gonna go all night. We're here until 11. The lights are gonna shut out. It's gonna be fine, guys. Just settle in. Why do I talk? All right.
Because you're funny and delightful, and they just hired you to do this?
Thank you. I'm gonna cry. It's really
Bad for the mascara.
It is. My daughter helped me do primer for this too. She's 11. So much of your work is about finding voice and place in a culture that seeks to erase women and their experiences. And yet, here we are in America in a time when women's rights and LGBTQ rights are being eroded. And in the process, people's voices are being eroded. You know, when you exclude trans women from sports, that's a voice that is not being heard, you know, body and movement that is not being seen. So what advice would you give to humans right now who are trying to find their voices in a world that tries to erase them?
Oh my gosh, that's a tall one. Let me think about it. I feel like the first thing everybody needs to do, whether or not they want to be a writer, is find your people. Women in particular are told that you need to be so bland a product that nobody will find you offensive. And I think the technical scientific term is fuck that shit.
That's how we say it here, yeah. I think regionally that's what we say.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we say fuck that shit as well. Yep.
That 12 letters, a good motto, suitable for needlepoint. Mm-hmm. But
tattoos.
But finding your people, and you've also, and it's also something you can get in books. I felt like books kind of understood me, sympathized with me, kept me company before I found it in actual living people, because I was a really weird, shy, withdrawn, and fairly traumatized kid. And then I worry a lot now. Social media is kind of a regularizing influence. I feel so lucky to have come up as a writer before a gazillion people could tell me why I was wrong and should shut up. And I feel for young people now constantly being kind of told to please everybody, things like that. So finding your voice is about, and I feel like in a way, writing formalizes something everybody needs to do, that before you can write, what is it? There's a Diane de Prima line, before you can write a single word, you must have an ideology. The lovely poet Diane de Prima, who died in San Francisco recently, that a lot of what we're doing is making the self who can write the work we're meant to write. And still, that's a creative act every single person does, whether or not they're going to write. Every life is creative. The major work you're going to make is yourself. What are you here to do? Who are your people? What are your values, your goals, your ideals? Are you going to be a comic writer, a poet? Are you going to be an investigative journalist? And, but so that's a really creative process. And we often get so focused, I think, in writing programs too, on and this goes back to kind of capitalism, which I'm not that fond of, cranking out product. And it's like before you can write, you have to figure out who's writing. And that's about who are finding the influences, finding the people, finding all those things. So those are all pieces of the project I think of as part of it. And also, and I can't say go be thick-skinned because of, the nature of our exciting social media public life is you do something, 500 people love you and 3 people attack you, and you go brood about that all day. And it's kind of like being in the forest 10,000 years ago, and there's flowers everywhere, but you still have to really think a lot about the saber-toothed tiger, because we're here to survive, and what feels like a threat, takes up a certain amount of time. So, I don't know. I will wake up at 3 in the morning and have a better answer.
I mean,
Come back, we'll be here.
I hate to push back,
the
but
lights
you
on.
did get these questions in advance.
No, I didn't. Or did I?
Yeah.
Oh, then I did. Okay, it's been very jumbly. I had to get up at
Got a
dawn
lot
in
of
San Francisco
emails. You
yesterday.
got a lot of emails. Yeah.
Right.
Does anybody else have questions before I say something rude? Oh, John's giving me the signal. Keep going. I have, okay, so here we go. Let's talk about climate. Let's
Okay.
do it. So
Thank you.
something that you might not know about Iowa is God has, in the past
the
15
wind.
years, God has smitten us a few times. We've had, in the times that I moved here in 2005, I've gone through 2 historic floods. In my town specifically, Iowa City, y'all got let off a little easy on 2016. I'm just saying that. No offense. We're not fighting. We're kind of fighting. And then we had, in 2020, we had this huge inland hurricane called a derecho. Climate change is happening, and it's affecting our lives. It's ruining our lives and our communities. So I guess, what can we do, and what is giving you hope right now in the movement to save our planet?
I know Iowa has more wind turbine and electricity generation than any other state was really exciting. And in a way, because this is a fairly conservative state, and there was this period where we were all supposed to do renewables because it was virtuous, like flossing. But
I don't do that. I don't.
Well, let me tell you, young lady.
All right.
Then you can rinse with champagne, which will not beat you up. It's okay. But what was I going to say? No, because there's actually this great paper, very hardcore scientific paper that came out that renewables, because there's been this whole we have to do climate, we have to leave fossil fuel behind, but renewables, and the complaint has always been they're very expensive. Obviously, Iowa didn't do wind out of virtue. They did it because it's the best way to make energy. The price of sun and wind keep going down. We've actually lived through the biggest energy revolution this planet has ever seen. We were going to stop getting energy by burning things because fossil fuel is already more expensive in 91% of the world than renewables, because somehow engineers and inventors have made this and economies of scale have made this so awesome. But I truly was excited about Iowa for a really long time, because there's a way, like in California, it's kind of like, yeah, Teslas are we know what kind of people are going to drive Teslas, but the F-150 Lightning is when we really have an electric car revolution. Thank you, Ford. And climate change is like a 3-way race. There's a kind of scientist who's giving us the news about the state of the oceans, temperatures. We're seeing climate events directly, the fire that burned for 4 months in New Mexico, what just happened in Florida, the flood in Pakistan that left 30 million people stranded, but somehow, according to most of the newspapers, was not as important as the fact that a 96-year-old lady, to everybody's astonishment, died. And nothing against her. It's not her fault. And not that she died, but that she got so much attention.
She knows what she did.
Yeah, well, they did have a crown on top of the beer with a giant diamond stolen from India in the 19th century that I thought was kind of a rude way to do it. As Pakistan, which was speaking, was talking about climate colonialism. But so it's a 3-way race. We've got more and more bad news about the state of the natural world and the systems, and from melting ice to fires, floods, hurricanes, heat waves, crop failures, which I know has been really big in the Midwest this year, withered crops. We have technological breakthroughs happening so astonishingly, and even the things that people are now being stimulated, I think, by propaganda from the fossil fuel industry to think of as problems, like the rare earth minerals we use in making batteries, are clearly being worked on by innumerable invisible engineers, and there's no reason to assume that we're at the end of the energy revolution and this is what batteries will be for the next indefinite future. It's changing really fast. And nobody's done the great overview story about, like, here's where we were in 2000, here's this wildly unimaginably different place we are in 2022. And people did not think we had an alternative to fossil fuel 20, 25 years ago. So and then the third piece is the climate movement. I actually spent, part of why I had to come here yesterday is I did an event on Tuesday with this amazing lawyer, human rights activist, and climate voice from Guam, Julian Aguan. And like so many people in frontlines communities, he's hopeful, fiercely hopeful. And the Pacific climate warriors who are from the small island nations in the South Pacific say, we're not drowning, we're fighting. The movement is growing, we're winning stuff. We're changing the way people think. The biggest battle we had to fight was to make the public believe climate change is real, urgent, we need to do something about it, and we know what to do. The banner in the 2014 Great March that in New York City with 400,000 people that was there to convince the Paris Climate Treaty to happen and go big. My favorite banner, like there was seven sections with seven banners said, we have the solutions. You still have people who believe it's too late, there's nothing we can do, we don't have the solutions, nobody cares. There's all the, the other thing I did, what maybe that's why I should have been rereading your questions today. Yesterday was a really long time ago. Was I just turned in a piece for the Greta Thunberg guest edited edition of the New Statesman, an essay called Despair is a Luxury. And it has been striking to me that those of us for whom despair means we're giving up so somebody else is gonna die and we're just gonna watch Breaking Bad reruns and eat junk food. We're not gonna drown, burn, lose all our rights, lose our islands, etc. if we comfortable middle class, global North people give up. So the movement is amazing. The young who've come forth are amazing. More and more a vision that Julian Aguan talked about is swimming into focus that the task before us is to actually, there's no way to address climate except by actually making a better world, a world where power as energy generation is decentralized, which will also decentralize political power. The fossil fuel industry, as Putin is Saudi Arabia, as the corruption of US politics, as so many terrible things, has really shaped the 20th and the early 21st century. Hello, George W. And hello, Iraq War. And, during the pandemic, they stopped burning a lot of fossil fuel in North India, and people saw the Himalayas for the first time in many decades. So more and more people have a vision that we can actually make a better world, that we know how to do it, we need to do it, it's the only way we can address climate. Pieces of it that I think are completely connected to more egalitarian, inclusive, nonviolent ideas around gender, race, post-colonial reality, our relationship to the natural world from the kind of hierarchical relationships of domination that were so much part of the 19th and 20th centuries in particular. So I see all this coming. And I also, for me, hope is not optimism. It's not like we're like, oh, it's all gonna be fine, which is, as you said in the intro, an excuse for passivity. I don't know what's gonna happen, but am I gonna gamble that we're gonna win or gamble that we're gonna lose? I am not gonna give up. The fossil fuel industry would like us to be hopeless and, and feel powerless. The enemies of what we need to do would love us to be despairing and to spread despair. They'd love us to give up. And, that's not my nature. I will not quit as long as there's any alternative. I will not surrender. And hope for me is, first of all, just not surrendering. It might not feel hopeful. And as we say at Not Too Late, our climate project, we totally respect despair as an emotion, but it's not an analysis, and it's important not to confuse the two. So that's kind of what hope looks like for me with climate. So much is happening, and this is literally, as the scientists have been saying for a while. We used to have in 2008, they said we have 12 years to get it right. We now have about 8 years to get it right. This is the decade of decision. We need everybody on board. If we move really fast to cut our carbon, our greenhouse gases in half, we can stabilize the climate. What a lot of people don't know is if we actually go carbon neutral, the parts per million of greenhouse gases will drop. We can actually reverse this process. We could actually reverse global warming if we actually are running this planet now. We've run it really badly, done the wrong things with the lack of knowledge or the wrong people in charge. We can do it differently. And so essentially we also need a world of global cooperation because we all have to decide as nations, as regions, to electrify, to stop burning fossil fuels, to protect forests, grasslands. Actually, two of the things that get me really excited are peat and grasslands. Prairies actually are more effective sequesters of carbon than trees. And when a fire happens, it doesn't all go up in smoke because most of it's underground. I actually want to do a prairie tour of the sort of center of the continent one of these days. But did I mention all I ever do is digress? Is it time to cut? Is it time
I
to
think
cut
we're going
or
to
get
do an
questions,
audience
or?
question. John's
Okay.
got it all under control.
Okay, this woman's going to ask about flossing, I know.
I
She's got her
know.
hand up.
All right,
It's
so
my
we do have
dentist.
time for a couple of questions, so if we could have quick
Thank you.
questions in the form of
I'm
questions.
here to preach the gospel of climate action.
Yeah, I love it. And I'm here to listen.
I'd like to ask if you would mention by name your favorite climate organizations that you're giving money to, and then if I could piggyback and digress, your favorite snappy comebacks. I used to work in male-dominated industries, and so I got to learn my 3 favorite jokes that were insulting to men, because that was what worked best. Anybody want to hear those later? I'll tell you later.
I want to hear later.
I'm actually on the board of Oil Change International, so they get the lion's share of my donations. I also support 350.org, which is still run by my friend May Bouvet, was co-founded by my friend Bill McKibben. Bill McKibben has found a great new group called Third Act for people over 60, because the climate movement has been so youth-focused, and he felt nobody was organizing older people who have a lot of resources, power, and experience that can do a hell of a lot. And so there's a ton of stuff happening in a lot of ways, but those are 3 that I would mention in particular right now. But also there's a lot of indigenous-led groups, specific fights like against the Line 3 pipeline, not very far from here in the Great Lakes. And one of the things that astonishes me, there's probably 10 years ago you could have been like, here's what's happening in the climate movement. There's now, I post news at not too late on, we have Facebook and Twitter accounts where we post encouraging news daily, and I cannot keep up. There's so much legislation happening, so many movements happening, so many pipelines like Joe Manchin's Mountain Valley pipeline shut down just Tuesday in Congress. I never thought I'd thank Mitch McConnell for anything, but I can promise you we'll always be very small. But it was really the climate movement that killed it, because activism works. So there's just so much going on right now. It is actually, there's terror, but also excitement in this moment if this is what you're involved in, and it's what I'm involved in right now. So thank you. And, men are not the enemy, except for some of them. It's optional. And it's kind of like, I wrote an essay a while ago called Whose Country Is This? Because I noticed that so many of the stories, we're always being told, oh, this Midwestern town was invaded by immigrants, and we're supposed to sympathize with, not think about what's it like to have been driven out by death squads from your home or by climate change from your home that you didn't particularly want to leave in Central America. Who do I identify with? Who's the story about? And they end up by saying this country has room for everybody who thinks there's room for everybody. And that's been a big credo for me. And, there are lots of women who are not feminists, lots of men who are feminists. Categories are leaky is one of my favorite go-to aphorisms. So there's a lot of different ways I respond depending on who the hell it is. So,
Yeah, more questions?
God,
All right, thank you. I
I
think
don't
we've
mean
got
to
time
sound
for maybe
nice.
one more if we've got any brave
Thank you,
soul
Kirk.
who wants to ask a question.
Last
I appreciate
question.
that.
Oh,
Okay, I've got
good.
one more over here.
Appreciate it.
Where are you going next, figuratively and literally?
I'm actually, like I've done, I love the pandemic. I got to not fly for almost 18 months because I'm actually, but I had to fly here because I wasn't going to drive here or take the train because I didn't have time. I'm picking up my car in Albuquerque and going to go see friends. I've been visiting, so this is part of why I'm being very careful about COVID. I've been visiting friends over 80, and thank you all you masked people. And now I'm going to go visit a friend who just had a major medical procedure and kind of tour through southern Utah on my way back to the Bay Area, and then go back to lots of climate board meetings because I'm on 2 advisory boards and the main board of Oil Change International. And we have not publicly announced this, but why I was on this road trip was I left on the 16th of September because we sent to our editors an anthology called Not Too Late with some of the best voices about climate we know. We wanted, the Not Too Late project we felt a lot of climate. Wind power is doing this. Wind power, we believe in you. So it is not yet 9. Is
I
it?
know, we were
No,
told that would
it's
happen at
8:15. We get 45 minutes more of light, come on. What was I going to say? That was very distracting.
The anthology,
Yeah, so
yes.
so the Not Too Late project was my wonderful friend Thelma Young Lutuna Tabua. That second name is because she married a climate activist based in Fiji, an amazing guy. And I, a couple years ago, realized we had the same sense that there's a lot of climate defeatism, despair, doomism, due to lack of good information or of good facts and good frameworks. The good facts are that we know what to do, we have the solutions, the scientists themselves are cautiously hopeful. If you talk to the best scientists, some of whom were in our anthology, they have not given up. And then the frameworks are understanding where power lies and how change works. If you think all power comes from above and they've decided against this, then you might be defeated, but history tells us otherwise. So we started this project and it turned into a book, and we got all these absolutely amazing people, Leah Stokes, Adrienne Marie Brown, the Pacific Island climate warriors to do stuff for us, and 2 IPCC scientists who are hopeful, and it'll be out in April, and it's designed to really be readable, upper level high school, undergraduates, college. We'll build a curriculum. We really want to do what a lot of the groups I'm involved with are doing, which is building gateways into the movement, and people are not active unless they believe there's something there's something that we can do, and literally that it's not too late. So we're kind of like the anti-defeatist team, and it's been really great. And I was used to I was always not always, but I've been paying a lot of attention to climate for about 20 years. I've been writing about it for most of that time. I was doing stuff like working with Rainforest Action Network, which was doing climate work before we knew it by protecting the Amazon and other rainforests. But I was 15 years ago, I was like, climate is very important, and so is this other thing I'm working on. And finally I was like, right now climate is more important than anything else. A lot of it's not that other stuff isn't important, but there's a lot of problems we have some time to solve. If we don't get this human rights issue right now, we can keep working on it. It took 80 years to get women to vote. It took a few decades to end slavery, but we really only have this decade on climate, so I'm trying to stay really focused on it, and I think that's where we wind it up. So, better stories. Thank you so much for listening and for coming and for supporting libraries, supporting this project, and thank you, Iowa.
Thank you, Rebecca.
All right, yes, thank you again to Rebecca and Liz, and thank you to the Coralville Public Library for being our gracious host. Thank you to all of you for coming out. I hope you will join us for other book festival events throughout the next couple of weeks. I know Rebecca and Liz would be happy to sign books out in the entryway, and we have a small reception there as well. Thanks to the Friends of the Coralville Public Library for that. And again, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening.